All right. I'm really excited for our event today, not only because our speaker is one of my best friends, but also because he has chosen a topic that endlessly echoes. After all, the question of what makes a great founder is very closely related to the question of what makes a great person. And the question of what makes a great person is very closely related to the question of what is great about being a person. In essence, these are questions of human nature, a topic of immense importance, too often ignored, both here and in other places. Of course, there are reasons to ignore that question. As we've seen in the last weeks and months in battlefields near and far, human nature can be depressing. Indeed, there are times when all of us must concede that man is no more than any animal: greedy, gruesome, and grotesque, violent and domineering, a beast. But there are also reasons not to ignore questions of human nature, for there exists another conception of mankind. Humans, not as animals, but as artists. Mankind, not at our worst, but at our best, guided not by the impulse to take or to destroy, but by the impulse to give and to create. This is the part of human nature that has previously inspired us to find a slab of marble, as Michelangelo did, and start carving until an angel is set free. This is the part that wills us to invent a car, a phone, a plane, a game, the part that wills us to write, that wills us to express our ideas in books and plays and poetry and art. This is the part that inspires us to build great companies, great products, great machines, great buildings. This is the part of human nature that covets beauty, not blood. And this is the part of human nature that the world needs more of. A humanity that builds and spreads beauty, a humanity that accepts the Gandhian view that we must be the change we wish to see in the world. I have incredibly high hopes that this is the view of humanity that all of you subscribe to too, which is why I have incredibly high hopes that you will be the change we so desperately need. And it is to be successful in being that change that all of us in this room should study human nature. We should study great people, study their accomplishments, and especially study their flaws. And here to teach us about all of these themes and more, everyone please join me in welcoming David Brillembourg Jr., a brilliant intellect and the founder of Dune Ventures.
Not an intellect at all. Thank you for the intro, Sahaj. As Sahaj mentioned, I spent a lot of my time thinking about the question of what are great founders, why do they matter, how do we create more of them, and how do we basically curate great founders in society. And so I'm going to start with a little history lesson if it doesn't bore you guys. But in 1840, this guy named Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish historian and philosopher, spoke about a few lectures and spoke about basically heroes and heroes in society. And it's basically the underpinning of this thing called great man theory. There's this famous quote that you guys may have heard of, the history of the world is but the biography of great men. And basically he talks about all these great people in the context of poetry, Shakespeare, kings, Napoleon, Rousseau, all these different thought leaders, intellects, etc. And he basically deifies them and says all of history should be viewed through the lens of great people. That we're not actually deterministic, things are not evolutionary, but these great people make things happen. And they're very random and very important that we actually care deeply about them. And so great man theory is, I think, a little bit superficial, but a lot of the underpinnings is how I view the world. I think these people are very rare, they are very important, and we do have to identify them and understand them in a very deep level. And in the more modern lens, this great thinker, Samuel Borja, wrote a piece called Great Founder Theory, where he talks a lot about basically the evolution of great man theory. But basically the underpinning of his philosophy is that society is built up of all these really important institutions, whether it's political institutions, technology institutions like Facebook, or religions like Christianity or Islam. And the biggest thing he finds is that almost universally, every important institution on the planet is built by individuals, really special individuals, or very small groups of people. It's never committees, it's never the product managers, it's really never large groups of people. It's always these really specific, opinionated people that deviate from the norm. And so once you start viewing history from that lens, and once you start understanding that all the important institutions around you are built by these really, really special people, you start to understand that most of the value in society is actually created by these great founders. And so, at the top here, there's this tweet where he talks about the key message, the key idea of great founder theory is that we have this incredible ability for human agency to shape history. And so it's basically the opposite view of what a lot of historians view, which is the world is very deterministic, where everything is very Darwinistic. It's very, everything was going to happen. The founding fathers were going to start the Constitution, but in reality, it's actually probably not true, right? These people were really special. They built things that were really, really important to us, and nothing points to the fact that they should have happened. Should have Oppenheimer built the nuclear bomb in the United States? Maybe not. Maybe history would have gone a very different way. And same for the founding fathers. Maybe we wouldn't have the United States. And so all these people, all these things, I think we take for granted in general. We think that society, especially in the world we live in, is kind of up and to the right, that technology just gets better over time, that chips are faster, that we have better phones. But people work really, really hard to invent those things. People work really hard to build institutions that invent those things. And basically, most people are actually not that important. And the most important people are more important than everyone else combined, is the actual underlying philosophy. And so here are some a few important, I think, historical examples outside of technology. Confucius, Muhammad, Charlemagne, all very different leaders, all very different important people. But not only did they have impact in their lifetime, not only did they build institutions that were important, but I think the interesting theme with all three of these people is that all the things that they built lasted for, I think, thousands of years. I think in China for 2,000 plus years, people were studying his work, and it influenced deeply everything about China. All of the Middle East is essentially inspired by Muhammad and his teachings. And so these people not only impact the current and the present, but they may impact the next 10,000 years. And so the importance is not only at a present level, but it's also everything, essentially. And so I think one last idea to think about the world and framework to think about the world is really power law. I think we all think of it as sort of the Pareto distribution or 80-20 rule. 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of the customers, or 80% of the internet's traffic comes from 20% of the websites. But in technology and really in finance in general, we find it's more extreme. So the most important company built in any given year is more important than basically every other company built combined. So Facebook in 2004, there's no other company more important than Facebook. Everything else is actually not as important as Facebook. And same for any company Elon started, or every other company. And so once you start to look at the world through the lens of power law, you start to realize that these great companies and great ideas and great people are actually really not only unique, but so much more important than basically everything else, right? And so if we didn't have the right systems to promote Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, we'd have a very different social system today, maybe a better one, maybe a worse one. And same for Elon. If Elon had not started SpaceX or Tesla, we wouldn't have electric cars at the scale we have them. We wouldn't be going to Mars in the way that we're hopefully going to Mars. And so all these things are much less obvious. I think people assume, again, that these things are up and to the right, but they're really not. These people are actually really unique. And if history is slightly different, then maybe they don't exist. Maybe we don't promote them. And so it's important to understand that there's basically one individual maybe in humanity that matters today more than everyone else. That person's name is probably Elon Musk. And everyone else is basically not as important. And so we have to really understand these characters, understand their flaws, understand how we can challenge them. And so I want to talk a little bit about how do we identify great founders? Why are they? We already talked about why they're important, why they're so unique and rare, but how do we identify them? And so I think usually in a traditional society we think about normal distributions. Most people are average height, average intelligence, average charisma. Founders are actually the inverse of a normal distribution. They're at the extremes only. So normally a founder is extremely charismatic, but also extremely difficult to work with. An extreme insider and extreme outsider. And so they have these extreme spiky traits. And so when we look at founders, and when I look for founders, we're not looking for someone who's well-rounded or really good or has no flaws. Actually, they should have a lot of flaws, but they should have really significant strengths. And the strengths should be really obvious, and they should be really spiky. And so we think more about the magnitude of the skills and the magnitude of the abilities more so than the lack of flaws. And so I think a lot of people try to, when they're going through a job interview, especially at really bureaucratic companies, you're actually minimizing downside. And so that's why a lot of great founders are actually not accepted by society. That's why they're inherently outsiders, because you really can't filter them in an interview because they have these such inherent flaws, right? They're inherently very different from the rest of us. And so I think that's the most important thing to understand, is that they're very spiky. They actually are not perfect humans like Carlyle talked about. They're not gods. They're actually very human. And they have even more intense imperfections than a normal person. And I think the other really interesting thing about these people is not only do they have these really extreme personality traits, but they tend to have the same personality trait inversed. So they tend to be both extremely charismatic, but at the same time extremely difficult to work with. I think the clear example of this is obviously someone like Steve Jobs. we talk about the reality distortion field. He's able to convince all these brilliant people to work for him, build all these great products. But you read the stories, and the guy's a total nightmare to work with. Demeans people, people burn out, low empathy. Obviously, Elon Musk is very similar, extremely, able to convince all these people to work for him. Obviously, extremely charismatic in some sense, but also autistic, low empathy. How can you both be super high empathy for humanity, but also low empathy for people? And so both those traits exist in the same person. And so again, these are not normal people. They're not nice or likable or any of these things. They can be both. And so that's why every great founder is both an outsider and an insider. Steve Jobs, college dropout, dropping LSD, not wearing shoes, long hair. You can filter him in any process, and at the same time, an extreme insider when it comes to Apple. And sometimes they fluctuate between both. Steve going from outsider to insider at Apple to being kicked out as an outsider, and then back to being the ultimate insider, creating the iPhone. And same for Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all these guys. And so again, all extreme personalities, all have the same personalities inversed at the same time, and both are shifting in between, both outsider and insider. And so I think once we understand these traits, understand that they're actually very human people, but also very important, the really ultimate question, and Sahaj and I debate this a lot, is how do we challenge these people without tearing them down? And so I think a common story that we think about is like, Bill Gates in the 90s, probably the most important person on the planet. People were comparing him to Bill Clinton, and then within a few years, people comparing him to Bond villains, right? And so society really tends to not like these individuals for a lot of reasons. One, because they tend to be really important, but also have these really weird characteristics that we don't understand. And so when we don't understand them, we tend to reject them. And so, we tend to reject the power that Bill Gates had, or the power that Steve Jobs had, or any of these people. Because they're so difficult to work with, because they have all these extreme personality traits. And so we tend to reject them, and we tend to lose them over time. And so I think a good example of this, obviously, is Steve Jobs being rejected and then coming back. And then in the latest, most modern example, Travis Kalanick built the most important, most valuable private company ever in Uber at the time, created so much value for shareholders, made everyone billions of dollars, created intense consumer demand for a product, did things that were not possible, fought all the regulators, did the right thing, and then ultimately totally rejected and is backturned by everyone that he created so much value for. So how does that make sense? Are we challenging him because he is so godlike, yet at the same time has these flaws where he was running a company in a totally inappropriate way? And should we accept these flaws, right? And so I think these are actually the really important questions, because are we okay with losing a Travis Kalanick? Are we okay with the lack of innovation at Uber for the last 5 or 6 years? And so we saw this with Steve Jobs at Apple. Apple went 20 years without shipping an innovative product and almost went bankrupt. And then the succeeding 10 years, Apple became the most innovative, most valuable company on the planet. And all because of this one variable, which is a founder. It was never going to happen like that. The company would have gone bankrupt. These things are not deterministic. We would have not had the iPhone. We would probably still be using BlackBerries or something like that. But again, we have these really unique individuals, and we were so close to actually losing these innovations that are so important to us every day. And so the margins are actually really small, and the real question we should ask ourselves are, what are the things that we've actually rejected from society? What are the founders that aren't great founders because we rejected them and pushed them aside? And what are the innovations we don't have today because of those systems? And so I think there is probably a way to challenge these founders without tearing them down, but I think we're quite good at tearing them down. We're not good at building them back up. And then I think I think one of the interesting things about the Steve Jobs case, and what it made me think as I was doing this tech last night, was that the natural entropy of startups, and this is an important framework, is basically, and really any institution, not even startups, is bureaucracy. Every institution that tends towards bureaucracy, tends towards committees, tends towards people with no skills, product managers, whatever you want to call them, basically the quote-unquote bureaucrat. And the founder's job, especially the great founder's job, ultimately is to fight entropy at every step. That's what Elon Musk is so good at. He's not only good at setting vision and being a great talent scout, he's ultimately running the largest scale startups in the world. Even though Tesla is a $1 trillion company or whatever it is, he runs it like a startup, which is extremely difficult to do. And so basically what founders do, and this inherent conflict, is founder versus bureaucrat, and the founder spends all his day basically fighting committees, fighting meaningless meetings, fighting requirements. And so if you look at all these great founders, all they do is dismantle these systems all day long. The problem is over time, the founder eventually leaves or dies, and the bureaucrats always win. And so every institution over time will become bureaucratic, and will start to ossify and not become innovative. And the only challenge to that we have is founders. And so the most important question is, how do we protect founders in these situations? How do we let them sort of extend the founding period and do what Elon's doing, which is continue to build these scale companies and continue to innovate at scale. And so I think there's this great scene that Sahaj and I both love, which is Steve Jobs versus Scully. Scully is the ultimate bureaucrat. Worked at Pepsi as a CEO, ran Apple, and almost ran it to bankruptcy. And then Steve Jobs obviously had to save it. And so there's some great lines here. I don't know if this will work with the audio, but we'll try.
We're losing market share and the Mac is losing money. Our only hope is the Apple II, which is stagnating because of its soon-to-be obsolete DOS. Users are already rigging their machines to run with a CP/M operating system that's been built to run on Intel. I can't put it more simply than this. We need to put our resources into updating the Apple II.
By taking resources from the Mac.
It's failing. That's a fact.
It's overpriced.
There's no evidence that it's...
I'm the evidence. I'm the world's leading expert in the Mac, John. What's your resume?
You're issuing contradictory instructions, you're insubordinate, you make people miserable, our top engineers are fleeing to Sun, Dell, HP, Wall Street doesn't know who's driving the bus, we've lost hundreds of millions in value, and I'm the CEO of Apple, Steve. That's my resume.
But before that, you sold carbonated sugar water, right? I sat in a fucking garage with Wozniak and invented the future because artists lead and hacks ask for a show of hands.
All right, well, this guy's out of control. I'm perfectly willing to hand in my resignation tonight, but if you want me to stay, you can't have Steve. Settle him out. He can keep a share of stock so he gets our newsletter. He'll have to sever his connection to Apple. I'm dead serious. I want the secretary to call for a vote.
I fucking dare you.
You have done an outstanding job over the years of cultivating the press, and by that I mean manipulating them, because none of them, and I'm...
So as you can see, I think there's a lot of themes that we talked about in that video, obviously very dramatized, but I think the core thing there, obviously, Steve Jobs, very difficult to work with, very contradictory, people were fleeing, total genius, obviously, and built the Macintosh, which today we still think about as one of the greatest products ever, maybe. But again, the bureaucrats did not really fully understand what he was doing. Did not give him the space to win. I think, especially in that era, there wasn't as much room to run companies in the way that Steve wanted to run companies. And so ultimately the bureaucrats won, even though Steve had started the company, built the great products, generated so much value for people like Steve Scully. I mean, Jobs personally recruited Scully to the company, right? And so ultimately that tension is there, right, between the founder and the bureaucrat. The bureaucrat will always want to protect shareholder value, will always want to protect committees and processes because it makes sense to them, because it can never be a founder. And doesn't fully understand innovation, right? So there's always this conflict. The conflict is the most important conflict that exists in institutions, and our job is really to protect founders, right? And I'll leave you with this last question, basically, which is how do we create more great founders? I think that's the most important question in society today. If we think they're as important as I think they are, and as rare as I think they are, and as misunderstood as I think they are, then our job is to build cultures and institutions and societies that promote and understand great founders. And hopefully we can both challenge them but also nourish them and help them build great innovations for all of us, right? Because ultimately we can do things on a daily basis, but Elon Musk will do more for society than anyone in this room combined, really. And so that's just the truth. And so we have to understand how we can promote them. And I think Elon Musk is a great example today of someone who is at the edge of being really deeply understood and also misunderstood, being so important but also so hated. And so he's towing a very dangerous line now that he may not be able to come back from. So thanks.
All right, everyone, let's do a Q&A, but I want to ask you a question, because this is something that we always debate about, which is, what about the wilderness, right? So Steve Jobs gets cut by Scully, and then he spends 10 years in the wilderness, but makes $1 billion on Pixar, becomes Disney's largest shareholder. Musk gets cut from PayPal, spends a while in the wilderness, comes back with Tesla and SpaceX. In some way, you have to kill a god to make a god, right? What do you make of that argument? Why shouldn't they be challenged?
I think the short answer is I don't know. I think in the case of Steve Jobs, probably not good for him to have been kicked out of Apple. I think he was probably a megalomaniac, probably very difficult to work with, and had very little grasp of reality. I think sending him back to reality let him kind of come back with a much more thoughtful approach to product building and company building that worked. But I think it's one of those things that it's so such a fine line, right? Because again, we do have to challenge these people, and they are great, but they're also so difficult to work with, and so misunderstood that they veer on doing really, really dumb things. I think again, Elon is a great example of this. Of buying Twitter is probably not the right economic decision, and probably a very not smart decision, right? So. Yeah, I think the two greatest founders of the last 20, 30 years were both Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, and both kicked out of several companies. Steve of Apple, and then Elon of both his first company Zip2 and his second company PayPal. And so I think maybe it is necessary. But the question is, if we're gonna tear them down, how do we make sure they have a comeback, right? Not all of them come back, and sometimes the teardown is too hard.
Let's open it up to questions from anyone else.
Thank you for the talk. Question regarding, some people say, they kind of, these people, they grew up under diverse factors. Steve Jobs was adopted and had like an issue with like not knowing his father and that stuff. And Elon Musk obviously also had some issues during his childhood. What's your take on how does that play into these? They're like driven, yeah. They're like kind of, as you said, like maniacs in many regards. And that's obviously something that we can't influence in institutions, or like, what bigger factor is it in the whole?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. And part of that question is basically, I think, nature versus nurture. I think someone like Thomas Carlyle will say it's all nature. These founders are godlike figures, and they're born with these great leadership abilities. I think it's obviously much more complex. We can't control how Elon Musk was raised, and it was probably important for him to have an abusive father that led him to kind of run the companies the way he runs them, right? So we can't manufacture those things. We can't manufacture nature, but we can nurture them. So the question, I think the more interesting example is, what would have Mark Zuckerberg done if he had started Facebook in Russia? Or in even, I think an even better example, France, would he have built Facebook to the scale he did? And I think the answer is actually probably no. He probably would have not met Peter Thiel. He probably would have not met venture capitalists that understood what he was building, that wanted to give him the money to scale. And I think that was an important part of that journey, right? And so when I talk about the institutions that make great founders thrive, I think we've done it the best in the United States, even though we have such a conflict of interest here in the US, where we both love founders and hate them. But I think we need to build these systems, whether it's some form of capitalism, but also loving innovation, loving freedom, and having paths for that. And so I think today in the US, venture capital is probably, which is why I'm a venture investor, is probably the best institution in the world for promoting founders. We look for outsiders. My entire job is to find these weird traits and fund them and enable them to kind of thrive, right? And so we need to build institutions like that support those founders and don't push them outside. And again, to your point on Elon and Steve and some of these other ones, a lot of them are neurodiverse. They have really severe issues, and so we have to, whether it's bipolarism or ADHD or autism, and so we have to make sure that we're protecting those people as well.
I want to push back a little on the idea that we have to support these founders rather than, did you say challenge, or what did you say, push them down?
Challenge or tear them down, yeah.
Because in my opinion, I feel like a lot of the progress that's been made and a lot of the innovation that's come out has been a response to this challenge. So do you think that there's some kind of line between really saying everything you do is great versus pushing back and challenging them? Because I feel that's important.
Yeah, I think, and to be clear, I obviously think these people are really important, but they have to be challenged, right? They're not gods, they're not perfect. They can make massive mistakes. And people with great founder skills can do both really great things and also really bad things for society, right? I think it's still up to debate whether Facebook is a good thing for society or not. And so we have to your point, I think we have to challenge them. But again, it's a fine line between challenging and tearing them down. And we have to make sure that we're in a society that promotes great founders, but doesn't promote megalomaniacs or promotes absolute control, because absolute control obviously absolutely corrupts.
Do you think the dynamic of founders being misunderstood is inherent in their greatness, especially now where I guess in my mind at least, with the proliferation of a lot of VC and PE firms and funds, there seems to be an oversaturation of, I guess, specific industry founders. So I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that tends to be right. I think great founders tend to be outsiders, like I said earlier, and insiders at the same time. So I think they somewhat have to be misunderstood to be great. I think it's like the classic quote of, hard times create strong men. I think great founders are built through hardships, doing the hard things. Being a great founder requires a ton of sacrifices, whether it's a technology company or a religion or a political institution. It's all struggle, whether military struggle or entrepreneurship struggle. And so by definition, I think those people need to have been grown up with a lot of adversity. And so, I think that's right. And so I think, and to answer, I think your last point, I think, I'm not sure if you're referencing this, but there's been almost like too much love for founders in certain communities in the US, I think, right? Especially venture, I think, is a big part of that. And so being a founder has become almost really cool thing to do. And so being a founder in the technology space is now a status symbol. You want to drop out or raise money. Like dropping out 20 years ago was a really special thing. Now people like me drop out. So maybe it's actually not a signal of everything. Maybe it's an anti-signal, right? And so being a founder today actually is such a status signal that maybe we've actually over-glorified it. And now the great people are even harder to find because there's so many founders. Back in the day, if you dropped out to go build personal computers, you were probably a pretty special person. Nowadays, if you go to drop out to start a software company, you're probably just chasing clout, right? And so it's really hard now to differentiate those founders. So I think now the power laws are even more extreme when it comes to founders, right? There are more founders than ever with more funding than ever, but actually very few that actually really matter, right? And so you can fund all the founders in the world, but none of them will be Elon or Mark Zuckerberg or any of these guys.
On your view, which would be like two examples of two different companies? One which would represent the complete philosophy of the founder's idea, which being operated as a startup from the beginning till it's already fully developed, etc. And the other one, which could be like a very much more traditional company, which can also be a very good one and very profitable one, and can also contribute so many things to the society. And well, this question about this example that you can give, or what do you think? It's more focused on the fact that, well, I do think that in this particular era, there might be a problem where, or there might be like a misleading thing that anything that can be related to technology can be considered as over like awesome, like anything can be the coolest thing ever. But there's also a good thing about institutionalizing the companies, because I mean, some of the companies more profitable nowadays have been there since very long time, and because of the normal procedures that they have.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think actually a great example is Apple, right? I think Apple is a great example of a company that's gone through multiple periods of both founder-driven company and then bureaucrat-driven company. And then today is actually an example of Apple is kind of in the middle, where it's obviously not a founder-driven company anymore. It's really a bureaucrat-driven company, but it's extremely well-run, right? Because it was built on the great underpinnings that have lasted decades of great products like the iPhone. And Tim Cook is maybe the ultimate bureaucrat, and I mean that in a really positive way, where he's taken something that really works and really maximized the value from it, but actually built very few net new products that are innovative, right? So I think Apple is the best example of a company that's actually really good, but also bureaucratically run. I think being an ossified institution is not necessarily a bad thing. I think religions need to ossify over time. That means they're good. I think political institutions need to ossify. They're not better based on you can't refound the United States over and over. It doesn't work that way. It needs to be founded once. It needs to have the founding fathers, and then it needs to continue to work. And we need to follow those principles for a long period of time, right? Refounding is by definition chaos. And so when we're talking about systems that are at civilization level scale, it actually doesn't work well. And so that's why technology today is so interesting, because you can have these basically mini events that are founding events. You can have them over and over again, and they can continue to push institutions forward. But I think this talk is not really about they're not again, bureaucrats are not necessarily bad people, and institutions that are slow are not bad. They can be actually quite good. I think the government's actually quite good at a lot of things because it is slow, because there's not a lot of change. But I think for a lot of things like technology, we need to actually have the opposite approach, which is founders are the only thing that matters.
Who would you say is the like last great founder, kind of the most recent one, if you can put it like that? Because
I mean,
it's
I
like,
think it's obviously Elon. Yeah. Yeah.
so I would say it's Elon, and after that we need to see. Okay.
Yeah, I think today it's Elon. Before maybe it's like Steve Jobs, and then before that it's probably not a technology founder. It's probably someone like Oppenheimer or Einstein. I think this great founders being technologists is a relatively new theme. Before inventors were not as deified as politicians or kings or poets, right? And so that's changed a lot. And so the field in which great founders exist has changed a lot over time. I'd say in the 1900s, Einstein and Oppenheimer are more important than any tech founder. But then in the 2000s, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk have been the most important people alive.
What would you consider to be kind of the most important factor when you're evaluating founders to invest in? What's like the one thing that you think someone could have as a founder that can overlook other things like experience or like domain expertise?
Yeah, I think one, great founders tend to not have experience because they're inherently outsiders. They have weird forms of experience, not traditional forms of experience. But I think the characteristics that I look for obviously are they all tend to be extremely intelligent in their own format or way, whether Steve with design and product or Bill Gates with software or Elon with hardware. So they tend to be, again, extremely spiky on a few specific spectrums, extremely intelligent, and then they have this extreme ability to withstand any sort of adversity. They enjoy the chaos of founding. Founders are inherently chaotic people. They inherently enjoy doing the difficult things, and they actually enjoy fighting authority. Only Elon Musk would sue NASA, even though NASA is his only customer. That's actually insane if you think about it. And so he did something that was actually inherently, everyone in the room, every committee in the world would have told you never sue your own customer, but he did it and succeeded at doing it. So I think they sort of enjoy fighting authority, and so I think you need to look for people that actually hate insiders, hate authority, but are highly intelligent and understand the systems. Again, that's why the dichotomy of insider-outsider is really important. Elon's an outsider. He's not a person who was in the space or the car space, but he spent a lot of time understanding those spaces at a very concrete first principles way and was able to design cars and rockets.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Bill Gates thing? Obviously, Thiel has the view, the antitrust case was wrong, we're tearing these guys down, we should leave them alone, they're the ones that matter. But how much of what you're talking about, how much of the value delivered to society is really the founder versus the founder and a specific idea and a specific endeavor? In other words, would Steve Jobs have mattered as much if he never did the iPod or the iPhone, but only was doing animated movies?
So I think great founders are what we call live players. They can do multiple things. They're not stuck with one persona. And so Steve is a great founder because he was able to build multiple products across different generations that all mattered, and same with Elon and same with a few other characters. But obviously, we call them great founders not because they create things, but because they create socially important things. The iPhone is not only important as a technology, it's important as a social technology. We use it to communicate every day. We use it for many different purposes. So it totally changed the way we think about communication. And then, potentially with cars and rockets, obviously with Elon, right? So I think the ideas and the magnitude of the ideas are actually the most important thing. When I used the examples earlier on great founder theory, these were people that had not only affected the present, but affected the future. And so the real question in the test for history for Steve Jobs is, how important is the iPhone in the context of the next 1,000 years? Maybe not important at all. Maybe we forget Steve Jobs, but remember Einstein. We will definitely remember Muhammad and Confucius and Charlemagne. And so these people are important because what they do not only affects the present, but affects the future. And so I think one of the interesting questions is Napoleon a great founder, right? We talk a lot about Napoleon as a leader in general in a lot of leadership classes. Napoleon won a lot of great battles, was a great leader, but ultimately lost and was exiled at the end twice. And so there's a lot of debate of whether he was able to actually institute real change. And same with Alexander the Great. He was able to conquer most of the world, one of the greatest military leaders ever. But what was his legacy? How did he change the world in a meaningful way? And so those are actually the interesting questions, right? The iPhone's obviously important today, but is it important 100 years from now? Does it change the way we communicate forever, right?
Just kind of following off of that point, I'm just wondering how easy will it be to push back against people when you're facilitating the creation of a system that inherently promotes these people and makes them more impervious to pushback, if that makes any sense? Because what...
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, there's no right answer. It's a fine balance. Again, if you build systems that don't support them, maybe they don't exist, and then you basically are in a sort of dark ages in terms of innovation. But if you do promote them, maybe you're promoting the wrong things, you're promoting excess, and maybe not building the right products. And so the answers I actually don't know. I think these are the important questions we need to think about. In general, I think it's better to promote them and then oversee them through committees and groups. And I think in general, because the world is already a forcing function against great founders, and because we're already pretty bureaucratic as people and committee-based, that in general, if we let them flourish, we'll also challenge them anyways, even when they build great things.
Yes, how do you think the traits needed to succeed differ between an environment, like you talked about Alexander the Great, like obviously everything worked really well for him when he was able to keep expanding the empire and constantly have a new flow of resources coming in from wherever he was taking over. Kind of similar to like businesses tend to do really well as their market shares are growing. But how do you view the differences in skills needed to succeed once you've already grown and largely gotten your market share to where it's going to be? Like when getting new customers no longer becomes cost effective, like how do you pivot?
So is your question more like, how do you continue to be a founder when a company essentially caps out? Is that the right way to view it?
Yeah, like do you need a different set of skills, maybe even a different person?
So I think for the majority of things, that's right. I think you look at technology companies, and natural evolution is founder starts a company, scales it with all these difficult things, and then over time, it's hit its peak, and you sort of want to ossify it. Again, the reason we use the word great is because some of these people are able to continue to extend the founding period and able to take, let's say, one idea like building a high-end electric car and then expanding the market to do more other things, more cars, mass-scale cars, battery packs, and then spaceships. Like basically, when we look at great founders, they're able to continue to push the boundary of what the market is and actually create new markets. And so I think the truly great founders are not capped by market; they create markets, and they want to continue to build new products, right? So that's why I think Apple's a good example of somewhere like they continually build products under Steve, and then have basically slowed down since in the last decade. And that's because maybe there are not great products to build. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I just think that a lot of this feels kind of anti-intellectual. You like threw names up on the board, you kind of made a lot of assertions without backing it up with any data. And you're talking about founders when in every case, you're actually talking about great ideas that were the product of groups of people. And often the founders, the one who like took it off, who continued to run the company. In the case of Facebook, it's literally just a legal battle. In the case of Apple, all the base
It's not just a legal battle. That's not right. That's a very anti-intellectual way to look at it.
Facebook could have been continued by a large number of other people. There were a bunch of co-founders.
That's not true.
Just like
there's
Apple.
not a single person in the world who could have run that company like Mark Zuckerberg ran that company. I can tell you that with a lot of conviction.
I mean, but that's just a baseless assertion, right? So
that's
my
not
point
a baseless
is
assertion.
that you're saying like the person who actually scaled an idea is the founder. Who's to say that all the...
So I think the most important thing to understand is that ideas are actually quite cheap. Like, it's very obvious we should build rockets, and it's very obvious we should build electric cars. Like, that's not a unique idea to Elon Musk. Like, Jeff Bezos has been doing it before, even before Elon Musk, right? The idea of building a social network, not a unique idea. Like, these are not unique ideas. Ideas are actually very cheap in venture and generally in technology. It's the way you execute on those ideas that's actually more important. And so when I'm telling you, like, it's actually not a baseless claim to make. Like, the reason that Zuckerberg built Facebook, he's the only person in the world who could have built that company. No other person in the world would have built it the way that he built it and scaled it the way that he scaled it. In 2009, when he built the newsfeed, which is basically a refounding of the company with new products, the customers rioted the office and said, we don't want this product. But he stand firm on the idea that this was going to be the future direction of the company. Do you think the Winklevoss would have done that? They're not founders. They would have never done that, right? And so you can take ideas, and maybe you can take a bureaucrat and take an idea and take it to its natural extent. But founders continue to refound the company and are able to create new versions of that company and scale it. whether it was the genius acquisition of Instagram or the genius acquisition of WhatsApp, or now his obsession with VR, which may be right or wrong. But my point is that no one would have built it the way he built it. No one can do cars the way that Elon does cars. That's why they're great, because the idea is actually quite obvious, but the way you do them is not.
But you're just basing that off of absolutely nothing, right? So like in the hypothetical world where that person doesn't exist, but the set of ideas still does, who's to say that the company wouldn't have been greater, wouldn't have been more successful with somebody else? You're just arguing in the void that it wouldn't be.
You're assuming that these ideas are like they're going to happen, like they're deterministic, but they're not, right? Like.
But most of these ideas are coming from technology. The technology is what
Well,
enables.
I mean, we talked about a lot of different things like religions, political systems, etc. Again, you're assuming these things are going to happen, but in fact, knowledge actually recedes over time sometimes. Like we went backwards in our knowledge on spacecraft for 30, 40, 50 years, right? Like these things are not up and to the right, and that's really the point of this conversation. Is like I think we take for granted that we're going to go to Mars and we're going to get better cars, and like these things are going to happen, but actually. In a lot of technology fields, knowledge recedes. I mean, the dark ages are an example of this, right? And so I think Elon's a great example because he took two industries where you had not built a new company essentially in for decades. No one had built a profitable, successful car company for maybe 100 years. And he did it, and he did it multiple times over, right? And so I think like this idea that these things are going to happen, that they're like, again, evolutionary, that they're deterministic, that the technology drives it. It's definitely true for a lot of cases, I think. And I'm not saying it's baseless claim. There are some things like we're going to get better iPhones, regardless if Steve Jobs or not. We're going to get better phones anyways. There's going to be better chips. But there are certain things, and this is why they're great founders, that are not going to happen automatically, and we need to enable them to do it.
But Tesla was founded right when batteries got to the point where they could sustain this. That is technology. That's because
sure, yeah,
a breaking point in technology.
100%, and
there's to lead a company.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that's my entire job is to understand where technology is enabling new companies to be built, right? Like Steve Jobs could not have built the iPhone unless you had the touchscreen technology and the right chips and all these things. So that's definitely true, but again, it's the way you do them and the way you execute them and the way you scale them that matters the most.
I disagree. I think it's how the question isn't how do we create great founders, it's how do we create great technology, and when it's ready to make that leap.
Do you think great technology just gets invented, or how does it disappear?
I think scientific research is like a slow and steady, batteries are improving, right?
So everything's just slow and steady, it's just happening. So Einstein is not like, it doesn't matter. Like it would have happened anyways?
But Einstein is like sort of a very different case because he like creates new systems of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but that's an example. It's a new system of knowledge. Whether it's a prophet that creates a new religion that's a new system of ideas, or the founding fathers. Again, they took ideas that mattered, but most importantly, they executed on those ideas and built the most important country in the world, right? And I think that's the most important thing here.
Yeah, I just disagree. I think
this is obviously an endless debate. A lot of people disagree. I don't.
It's getting circular.
I think also it's like very complex. I think to your point, like I agree with a lot of things you're actually saying, right? Which is technology. Like you in fact, I think so. I'll actually agree with you on one point, right? Like Steve Jobs failed at a lot of things because a lot of the time he actually mistimed the technology. He was so brilliant, yet the Macintosh was maybe a few years earlier than it should have been, right? He mistimed where the technology would be. And then with Next, an even bigger failure where, again, he mistimed the technology, he didn't really understand. And Steve Jobs in the last era timed it all perfectly, where it all sort of worked to his advantage, where we had the internet and we had the technology there so we could build the iPhone, right? And so, again, I don't totally disagree with you. I think there are certain things that limit great founders to build what they build, and there's other enabling things. Like Steve Jobs benefited so much from the internet, which he did not build, and he had no reason to know that it would be built, right? So it's more complex for sure. But I still think great founders are the most important determinant.
I just think you'd plug in a great many other people and they would have done it more successfully.
I disagree, but I think that's where we ultimately disagree.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Great questions, by the way.
No, really come at him. Like, we have another couple minutes if anyone wants to, like, go for it. No, I actually I'm not attacking her. I actually
I think those are great questions.
I think that's what we want. We want it to be sharp and,
I don't know. Wait, so this kind of, remember like the Parmenides theorem thing that we talked about in Bobbitt's class?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this might be a little bit of an example of that, where you're comparing the future that you're comparing the present right now when you're thinking of these inventors to the past, as opposed to a future that would have occurred if like we followed the same course without that person.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. So like, I think to Remy's point, I think that we need to keep in mind that we need to compare these current situations to such situations that would have transpired with another unknown person in place that may have been able to do it better, as
Yeah,
opposed to comparing it to a past where
of
this
course.
technology wasn't really invented yet, or someone else hadn't really filled those shoes. Someone else, I think to Remy's point, would have inevitably filled those shoes, especially given that, I mean, I agree with the fact that this technology is going to be pressing further and further no matter what. Because in a case like what we're talking about the Dark Ages, like knowledge was far less like easily, I guess, spread. Like it's far more accessible now. So I think that with that in mind, it's a little bit myopic to say that there is even like a remote chance that we're going to be like going backwards in terms of like future technological changes.
Yeah, but again, I think the underlying idea here is that if we don't work to make it better, things will go backwards. Like that, the natural tension is founding versus bureaucracy, and so if that's a natural tension, then therefore, like everything tends to recede over time. Like knowledge is not like we need to fight, we need to create progress. Basically, is the underlying thought, right?
Yeah,
and founders create progress generally. Whether you agree that it should have been Elon or Mark or the big what ifs, I think most importantly is like these things aren't going to get better on their own. People have to work. Like human agency is the most important thing here. We need to believe we can make them better and work on making them better.
I agree with that. I think that my main, my only like pushback against that would be that we're kind of in a place right now where the like route of path dependency is sort of like this press forward as opposed to going backwards. And I think it would take the affirmative effort to suppress information or suppress current prevailing systems.
Yeah, I think we live in, totally agree. I think we live in one of the best times ever. But again, there are spaces, and again, space is the best example. We were receding, we were not getting better. We actually lost a lot of knowledge on how to build, how to go to the moon, for example. It's taken us a long time to figure that stuff out. And one individual was able to change the spectrum on that very quickly. And that actually probably wouldn't have happened without him and his obsession with it. Because if we look at another guy who's also a genius, Jeff Bezos, started Blue Origin 2 years before SpaceX started. He's not even close to where SpaceX is, right? And he's one of the most brilliant founders ever. So that explains to you how really difficult these problems are and how non-obvious they are, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, I feel like the aerospace technological development is such an outlier in a certain way. Do you have other examples of technology?
Let me throw you one, nuclear.
Yeah, I think nuclear is also partly regulatory, but yeah. I think, again, the bureaucracy, I think we've actually seen, this is the Peter Thiel argument, it's not original to me, but I think it's the idea that actually innovation is stagnating, that we've accelerated in the information technology world. We have faster phones, we're able to communicate all these things so quickly, but actually everything around us is stagnant. Everything around us is actually